Hello, my name is Noah. My group mates are Josh, Ashley, and Max, and today we're going to be talking about Limitless, the Federal Reserve takes on a new age of crisis by Gianna Smialek, specifically Chapter 7, March Madness. So in this chapter, it talks about essentially the craziness that happened in March of 2020 where the U.S. financial system came dangerously close to failing, not just because banks weren't working, but because the market as a whole completely stopped. Everyone was panicking, trying to sell everything off, and even things that were considered to be safe assets became super unstable. So the question that this chapter that we're going to go through is, could the Federal Reserve prevent this meltdown? And we're going to get into how and why that they were able to minimize the damages from this meltdown. So before we get into what really happened in March, we have to understand the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is basically kind of like the lender of last resorts, which means if the banks get in trouble, like they were running low on cash, the Fed can step in and give them money so they don't default. And it's kind of like a safety net for the banking system. But in this chapter, we're not really talking about the Federal Reserve's role in the banking system, but how they saved the entire financial system as it began breaking down in March because of COVID. So markets that are typically very safe, like U.S. Bonds and treasuries, suddenly just stopped working. Everyone was panicking and trying to sell everything at once, and there was nobody buying, which kind of broke the market. So the Federal Reserve stepped in to help, but instead of what they usually do of lending to banks, they stepped in directly to the market and became the buyer of the market, since everyone was trying to sell and nobody wanted to buy. So this is why they called the Federal Reserve, the market maker of last resort, because it kind of, similar to the banking system, when they ran out of money, kind of saved the market in a time of crisis. So it's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, when no one was willing to buy and everyone was trying to sell, the Fed bought to keep the markets running. Doing this helped calm everyone down, and investors could see that there was at least a reliable buyer in the market, which helped restore confidence and helped keep money flowing through the market. So the big idea here is that the Federal Reserve isn't just working behind the scenes by changing interest rates, as we've been learning throughout the semester, but in this case it actually steps straight into the markets to keep the money moving and prevent a total meltdown. And this is important because if the money stops flowing, then businesses can't borrow and markets freeze, and that's when there's large layoffs, bankruptcies, and huge recessions. So the main takeaway from this chapter is that in the extreme situation, the Feds don't just support the banks, they now step in to help support the entire financial market.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm talking about the mechanism number 2 for Fed intervention. So by the middle of March 2020, financial markets were in serious trouble. Investors were panicking and selling assets quickly, and many markets were close to freezing. At this point, the Federal Reserve realized that normal tools would not be enough. So the Fed turned into emergency powers, knowing that Section 13.3, this rule allows the Federal Reserve to lend money during what is called unusual exigent circumstances, which basically means extreme emergencies where the financial system is at risk. Using these emergency powers, the Fed created several leading programs almost overnight. The programs were designed to provide money directly to different parts of the financial system that were under stress. One of the most important things that Fed did was buy massive amounts of assets, especially U.S. Treasury bonds and corporate bonds. Normally, investors buy these assets, but during the crisis, buyers disappeared, so the Fed stepped in and became the buyer itself. The Fed also backstopped key markets, which means guaranteed support if markets continue to struggle. This reassured investors that they wouldn't be left out without buyers. The key ideas here is that the Fed became what economists call a buyer of last resort. Instead of waiting for private investors to return, the Fed stepped in first to stabilize the system. This strategy worked because confidence is extremely important in financial markets. Once investors saw that the Fed was willing to step in and buy assets, panic began to slow down. You can think of this like, imagine a crowd running out of a building because they think it's unsafe, but then the firefighters arrive and secure the building. Once people see help has arrived, they feel safer returning. That's exactly what happened in financial markets. The Fed stepped in, restored confidence, and gradually private investors started buying assets again. Markets slowly began functioning normally. Now I'm going to be talking about the data and real examples. So to see how powerful these actions were, we can look at actually what happened in the markets during this time. In early March 2020, stress levels in financial markets rose very quickly. The treasury markets, which is normally calm and stable, became very highly volatile. Prices moved rapidly and the trading became difficult. At the same time, the corporate bond spreads widely sharpened. This means that companies suddenly had to pay much higher interest rates to borrow money. Investors demanded higher returns because they were worried about risk. But after the Federal Reserve stepped in, using its emergency programs, things began to change. Borrowing costs started to fall, and investors slowly returned to the market. Within weeks, markets that had nearly stopped functioning were operating again. You could picture this as a simple graph. At first, stress levels spiked sharply in March, slowly showing panic and instability. Then after the Fed announced the intervention, stress drops quickly and showing markets stabilizing. So overall, the data shows a clear pattern. When the Fed stepped in an emergency leading and assets purchased, markets stabilized and confidence returned. This moment shows how powerful Federal Reserve interventions can be during a financial crisis and how quickly conditions can improve once investors believe that the system is being supported. As the crisis in March 2020 continued to get worse, the Federal Reserve realized that lowering interest rates alone would not be enough to fix the problem. Markets were still freezing and investors were still panicking, so the Fed turned into emergency powers under something called Section 13. Section 13 allowed the Federal Reserve to provide emergency loans during what were called an unusual and exigent circumstances, meaning extreme situations where the financial system is in danger. Using these emergency powers, the Fed created new leading programs to support important parts of the federal system. One of the biggest actions that Fed took was buying massive amounts of assets, including the U.S. Treasury bonds and corporate bonds. At the time, private investors were too scared to buy these assets, so the Fed stepped in and became the buyer instead. This made the Fed what economics call a buyer of last resort. By stepping in, the Fed helped prevent prices from collapsing and kept markets from functioning. We can all see the results of these actions in real-time data. In early March 2020, stress in the Treasury market increased sharply and companies faced much higher borrowing costs. Corporate bonds spread widely and quickly, showing that the investors were nervous and demanded higher returns. But after the Federal Reserve announced its emergency programs, markets began to stabilize, borrowing cost drops, investors slowly returned, and markets that were close to shutting down started working again within weeks. This shows how powerful Federal Reserve interventions can be by a crisis. By stepping in at the right moment, the Fed restored confidence and helped prevent the financial system from collapsing.
Hello, my name is Josh Lim, and I'm going to be going over the takeaways from Chapter 7. So after everything that we discussed, what are the big takeaways? What should we actually carry forward from Chapter 7? The first major takeaway is that the Federal Reserve's role has expanded and likely in a lasting way. In the past, the Fed operated mostly behind the scenes. It adjusted interest rates and influenced economic conditions indirectly. Its presence was important, but it wasn't always visible in day-to-day market functioning. That's no longer the case. Now we've seen that during crises, the Fed doesn't just guide the economy, it actively intervenes. It buys assets, creates lending facilities, and steps directly into financial markets to restore stability. And importantly, once the central bank demonstrates that it can act this way, it becomes much more likely that it will act this way again in future crises. So this isn't just a temporary shift, it's part of a new normal. The second takeaway is that modern financial crises are no longer just about banks. They're about markets as a whole. In earlier eras, financial instability often centered around banks failing or experiencing liquidity problems. But today's system is far more complex and interconnected. We have global capital flows, massive bond markets, and a wide range of financial institutions operating outside traditional banking structures. Because of that, when stress hits the system, it doesn't just stay contained. It spreads across multiple markets at once. That's why the Fed's response has evolved. It's not enough to just stabilize banks anymore. The Fed now has to stabilize entire financial ecosystems. And that reflects a deeper truth about our modern economy. Everything is connected. Now, the third takeaway, and is where things get more complicated, is that there is a real trade-off involved in all of this. On one hand, the Fed has shown that it has the tools and the ability to prevent economic collapse. It can quickly restore confidence and keep markets functioning even under extreme stress. That's incredibly powerful, and in many ways, it's been essential in avoiding deeper and longer-lasting crises. But on the other hand, that power raises important questions. The more the Fed intervenes, the more influence it has over financial outcomes. And because of that, it can lead to concerns about fairness and about who benefits most from these actions and who does not benefit from these. It can also create incentives for risk-taking. If markets believe that the Fed will step in during times of trouble, there's a possibility that investors take on more risks than they would otherwise do so, expecting support if things go wrong. And finally, it raises broader questions about the role of a central bank in a democratic society. At what point does economic stabilization begin to overlap with political decision-making? So the big so what from this chapter is this. We have a Federal Reserve that is more active, more powerful, and more central to the functioning of the economy than ever before. And while that power can be incredibly effective in stabilizing crises, it also brings ongoing tensions between maintaining stability and avoiding overreach. That tension doesn't have a simpler answer, but it's going to shape how we think about economic policies for years to come. As we step back from everything we've covered, what really stands out is not just what the Federal Reserve did during these crises, but what it has ultimately become. We're looking at an institution that has evolved in real time. What began as a central bank primarily focused on adjusting interest rates and managing inflation has transformed into something much more active, much more visible, and much more central to how the economy actually functions, especially in moments of stress. And what transformations didn't happen in isolation, it happened because the world around it changed. Today's financial system is incredibly fast, deeply interconnected, and highly complex. Markets are no longer separate or contained. They're linked across sectors, across countries, and across different types of institutions. So when something breaks, it doesn't break quietly, it spreads, and often it spreads faster than anyone expects it to. And in that kind of environment, the cost of inaction becomes much greater. Doing nothing is no longer a neutral decision, Doing nothing can only allow fear to build and can freeze markets and turn what might have been a manageable disruption into a full-scale economic crisis. Because of this, the Federal Reserve is no longer just responding to economic conditions. It is actively working to prevent these instability from turning into collapse and ultimately doing much more harm. It has become in many ways a stabilizer of last resort, not just for banks, but for the entire financial system. And that is a profound change because it means that in moments of crisis, the Fed isn't just influencing outcomes, it's shaping them directly. And this means that it's stepping into markets, restoring confidence, and making sure that the basic functions of the economy, like borrowing, lending, and investing, can continue. But with that expanded role comes a new layer of complexity and a new set of questions that don't have simple or comfortable answers. For example, how much intervention is too much, and what point does stabilizing the system begin to interfere with how markets are supposed to function on their own, and how do we ensure that these interventions don't unintentionally favor certain groups over other? Because once the Federal Reserve demonstrates that it can step in and stabilize markets, expectations begin to shift. Investors, institutions, and even governments may begin to act differently, not just based on risk, but based on the belief that support will be there if things go wrong. So, if you have to leave with one final thought, it would be this. The Federal Reserve has become a cornerstone of stability in a system that is inherently vulnerable to shocks. It's about understanding how the system that supports our jobs, our businesses, and everyday lives are being maintained, and how they may continue to evolve in the future and push on through crises. Thank you for listening to our presentation.